Have you ever noticed something strange about people? When you stay, they rarely seem to notice. When you give your time, your patience, your understanding, it slowly becomes expected. And the more you try to show how much you care, the more normal your presence becomes. Almost invisible, but something very unusual happens the moment you quietly decide you're done. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with anger. Just a quiet shift inside you. A moment where you stop explaining yourself, stop proving your intentions, stop trying to convince someone to see your value. And suddenly the atmosphere begins to change. The same person who barely listened before starts paying closer attention. The same person who seemed distant suddenly becomes curious. Sometimes they reach out more. Sometimes their tone changes. Sometimes they begin asking questions they never asked before, and you might find yourself wondering something confusing. Why now? Why does the reaction come only when you've already made peace with leaving? Why didn't they notice when you were trying so hard to keep things together? Why does your silence suddenly speak louder than all the explanations you gave before? It's a strange experience. For a long time, you might have believed that if you just communicated better, if you just showed more patience, if you just tried a little harder, things would eventually change. But the moment you stop trying to hold everything together, that's when something shifts, almost as if the energy between you suddenly becomes visible. And here's the question very few people ask themselves. Is it possible that people only realize your value when they sense you no longer need them to recognize it? Is it possible that the moment you stop chasing understanding, you begin to project something entirely different? Something quieter, something stronger? Because sometimes the most powerful message you ever send to someone is not spoken at all. It's the moment they feel that you're no longer trying to stay where you're not valued. And strangely enough, that's often the exact moment they finally begin to notice you. Before we go any further, there's something important you need to understand. If you've ever stayed too long in a situation where you felt undervalued, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean you lack self-respect. It doesn't mean you're weak. And it certainly doesn't mean you were foolish for trying. Most people stay because they care. They stay because they believe relationships deserve patience. They stay because they believe people can grow. They stay because they hope the effort they give will eventually be understood. And sometimes they stay because they remember who someone used to be, or who they believe that person could become. Human beings are naturally wired for connection. We want to believe that understanding, kindness, and loyalty will eventually be returned. So when something begins to feel unbalanced, many people respond the same way. They try harder. They explain themselves more clearly. They give more patience. They make more compromises. They adjust their behavior hoping things will improve. Not because they're desperate, but because they believe effort is the responsible thing to do. But over time, something subtle can begin to happen. The more you try to prove your intentions, the more your effort becomes the foundation of the relationship. Your patience becomes expected. Your understanding becomes assumed. Your presence becomes normal. And what is constantly available often becomes invisible. This doesn't necessarily mean the other person is cruel or intentionally dismissive. In many cases, they simply become accustomed to your effort. Human perception adapts very quickly. When someone always shows up, we subconsciously begin to expect that they always will. When someone constantly tries to explain themselves, we begin to assume they always will. And when someone repeatedly works to maintain a connection, the responsibility for the emotional balance of that connection slowly shifts onto them, without anyone consciously deciding it. This is where many people begin to feel confused. Because they're doing everything they believe they're supposed to do. They're communicating. They're being patient. They're trying to resolve misunderstandings, yet somehow the dynamic still feels uneven. What they often don't realize is that emotional dynamics are shaped by something deeper than words. They're shaped by internal belief. Joseph Murphy spoke often about this idea when he described the role of the subconscious mind. According to his teachings, life does not respond primarily to the effort we display. It responds to the emotional beliefs we carry beneath the surface. If someone begins to feel, even subtly, that they must work to maintain another person's attention, that feeling becomes part of their internal state. And that internal state begins to influence the way they interact. Their tone changes slightly. Their posture changes slightly. Their emotional energy becomes more focused on holding the connection together, even if they don't realize it. And the people around them sense this energy. Even if they cannot explain it logically, human beings are extremely sensitive to emotional signals. We can often feel when someone is trying to hold on to us. We can feel when someone is unsure about their own value in a relationship. And while this doesn't mean the other person will intentionally take advantage of it, it does change how the dynamic feels. The moment one person begins trying harder to keep the connection stable, the emotional balance quietly shifts. One person becomes the pursuer. The other becomes the one being pursued, and over time, this can create a sense of distance. Not because either person planned it, but because emotional dynamics naturally move toward balance. So if you've ever found yourself feeling like you were carrying the weight of maintaining a connection, it's important to understand something. You weren't wrong for caring. You weren't wrong for trying to fix things. You were simply responding in the way many people are taught to respond. But the deeper truth is this. Trying harder to earn someone's recognition often creates the opposite effect, because recognition is not usually triggered by effort. It's triggered by perception. And perception changes the moment your internal state changes. When you stop trying to prove your value, something begins to shift inside you. Your emotional energy becomes quieter. Your attention moves back toward your own life. Your sense of self becomes less dependent on someone else's response. And the moment that internal shift becomes genuine, the dynamic around you begins to change. But to fully understand why that happens, we need to look at a very common misunderstanding, a misunderstanding that keeps many people stuck in the exact pattern they wish would change. Because the real issue isn't that people don't care. The real issue is that most people don't realize how their own internal state is shaping the entire dynamic without them even knowing it. Most people grow up believing that the way to fix a relationship is to try harder. If there is distance, communicate more. If there is misunderstanding, explain yourself more clearly. If someone seems cold or distracted, show them more patience. This advice sounds reasonable. In many situations, it even seems wise. After all, effort is often associated with care. But there is a quiet problem hidden inside this idea. Effort can sometimes create pressure, and pressure rarely produces the kind of connection people are hoping for. Think about what happens internally when someone feels they must work constantly to keep a relationship stable. They begin paying close attention to every reaction. They analyze every message. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering if they said something wrong. Slowly, their focus shifts away from simply being present and toward managing the other person's response. Without realizing it, they begin operating from a place of emotional uncertainty, and uncertainty changes energy. Joseph Murphy often explained that the subconscious mind responds to feeling much more strongly than it responds to logic. You might tell yourself that you're calm. You might try to act confident. But if beneath the surface there is a quiet fear of losing someone, that feeling becomes part of the signal your subconscious mind sends out, and people sense that signal. Human beings are extremely sensitive to emotional states. We can feel when someone is relaxed and comfortable. We can also feel when someone is trying very hard to maintain a connection, even if nothing is said directly. This is where many relationships quietly become unbalanced. The person who begins trying harder often believes they are protecting the relationship. But from the outside, their effort can appear as dependence. Not because they are weak, but because emotional certainty has been replaced by emotional negotiation. They begin negotiating for attention, negotiating for understanding, negotiating for reassurance. And the moment a relationship enters negotiation, perception changes. The person who appears less dependent often appears more stable, more grounded, more valuable. Again, this is not about manipulation or playing games. It's simply how human perception responds to emotional signals. The moment someone senses that another person needs their validation, the urgency to provide that validation often decreases, not out of cruelty, but because the emotional balance has shifted. The relationship is no longer two people standing side by side. It becomes one person reaching and the other responding when they feel like it. This is why many people find themselves stuck in exhausting patterns. They give more attention hoping to receive attention back. They show more patience hoping patience will eventually be returned. They invest more energy hoping the other person will recognize that investment. But recognition rarely comes from effort alone. Recognition comes from perception, and perception changes the moment emotional independence appears. Think about moments when you've met someone who carried a calm sense of self-assurance. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They weren't explaining their worth. They simply existed with quiet confidence. That kind of presence naturally attracts attention, not because the person demanded it, but because emotional certainty is deeply noticeable. Joseph Murphy described this as the power of internal belief. When the subconscious mind accepts a belief as true, it shapes the emotional tone you carry into every interaction. If the subconscious mind believes your worth depends on someone else's approval, your behavior will unconsciously reflect that belief. But if the subconscious mind accepts that your value exists independently of anyone's reaction, your energy changes. You stop negotiating. You stop trying to prove yourself. You stop adjusting your entire emotional state based on someone else's response. And this is where the biggest misunderstanding occurs. Many people think the turning point in a relationship happens when someone announces they are leaving. But the real turning point happens much earlier. It happens the moment you internally accept that you are willing to walk away. Not angrily, not dramatically, just calmly realizing that your peace is more important than holding on to something that constantly drains you. That quiet internal decision creates a powerful shift. Because the moment you truly accept that you no longer need someone's validation, your subconscious mind releases the tension of trying to earn it. And when that tension disappears, something surprising begins to happen. Your presence becomes calmer, your attention returns to your own life. Your emotional energy becomes steady instead of reactive, and the people around you begin sensing that change. Sometimes they notice it immediately. Sometimes it takes a little time. But eventually, the dynamic that once felt unbalanced begins to move in a different direction. Not because you forced it, but because the signal you're sending into the world has changed completely. And this is where the deeper principle begins to reveal itself. Because according to the teachings of Joseph Murphy, this shift is not simply psychological. It is connected to something much deeper about the way the subconscious mind influences the reality we experience. Most people grow up believing that the way to fix a relationship is to try harder. If there is distance, communicate more. If there is misunderstanding, explain yourself more clearly. If someone seems cold or distracted, show them more patience. This advice sounds reasonable. In many situations, it even seems wise. After all, effort is often associated with care, but there is a quiet problem hidden inside this idea. Effort can sometimes create pressure, and pressure rarely produces the kind of connection people are hoping for. Think about what happens internally when someone feels they must work constantly to keep a relationship stable. They begin paying close attention to every reaction. They analyze every message. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering if they said something wrong. Slowly, their focus shifts away from simply being present and toward managing the other person's response. Without realizing it, they begin operating from a place of emotional uncertainty. And uncertainty changes energy. Joseph Murphy often explained that the subconscious mind responds to feeling much more strongly than it responds to logic. You might tell yourself that you're calm. You might try to act confident. But if beneath the surface there is a quiet fear of losing someone, that feeling becomes part of the signal your subconscious mind sends out. and people sense that signal. Human beings are extremely sensitive to emotional states. We can feel when someone is relaxed and comfortable. We can also feel when someone is trying very hard to maintain a connection, even if nothing is said directly. This is where many relationships quietly become unbalanced. The person who begins trying harder often believes they are protecting the relationship, but from the outside their effort can appear as dependence. Not because they are weak, but because emotional certainty has been replaced by emotional negotiation. They begin negotiating for attention, negotiating for understanding, negotiating for reassurance, and the moment a relationship enters negotiation, perception changes. The person who appears less dependent often appears more stable, more grounded, more valuable. Again, this is not about manipulation or playing games. It's simply how human perception responds to emotional signals. The moment someone senses that another person needs their validation, the urgency to provide that validation often decreases, not out of cruelty, but because the emotional balance has shifted. The relationship is no longer two people standing side by side. It becomes one person reaching and the other responding when they feel like it. This is why many people find themselves stuck in exhausting patterns. They give more attention hoping to receive attention back. They show more patience hoping patience will eventually be returned. They invest more energy hoping the other person will recognize that investment. But recognition rarely comes from effort alone. Recognition comes from perception. And perception changes the moment emotional independence appears. Think about moments when you've met someone who carried a calm sense of self-assurance. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They weren't explaining their worth. They simply existed with quiet confidence. That kind of presence naturally attracts attention, not because the person demanded it, but because emotional certainty is deeply noticeable. Joseph Murphy described this as the power of internal belief. When the subconscious mind accepts a belief as true, it shapes the emotional tone you carry into every interaction. If the subconscious mind believes your worth depends on someone else's approval, your behavior will unconsciously reflect that belief. But if the subconscious mind accepts that your value exists independently of anyone's reaction, your energy changes. You stop negotiating. You stop trying to prove yourself. You stop adjusting your entire emotional state based on someone else's response. And this is where the biggest misunderstanding occurs. Many people think the turning point in a relationship happens when someone announces they are leaving. But the real turning point happens much earlier. It happens the moment you internally accept that you are willing to walk away. Not angrily, not dramatically, just calmly realizing that your peace is more important than holding on to something that constantly drains you. That quiet internal decision creates a powerful shift, because the moment you truly accept that you no longer need someone's validation, your subconscious mind releases the tension of trying to earn it. And when that tension disappears, something surprising begins to happen. Your presence becomes calmer. Your attention returns to your own life. Your emotional energy becomes steady instead of reactive. And the people around you begin sensing that change. Sometimes they notice it immediately. Sometimes it takes a little time. But eventually, the dynamic that once felt unbalanced begins to move in a different direction. Not because you forced it, but because the signal you're sending into the world has changed completely. And this is where the deeper principle begins to reveal itself. Because according to the teachings of Joseph Murphy, this shift is not simply psychological. It is connected to something much deeper about the way the subconscious mind influences the reality we experience. To understand why people sometimes react so differently when they realize you are leaving, we have to look deeper than behavior. Because what changes in that moment is not just your actions. What changes is your internal state. And according to Joseph Murphy, the internal state is the real cause behind most of the experiences we attract in life. Murphy often explained that the subconscious mind functions like fertile soil. Whatever belief is planted deeply enough in that soil eventually begins to express itself in the outer world. Not through magic or force, but through subtle changes in perception, attitude, and interaction. If the subconscious mind accepts the belief that your value depends on someone else's approval, your behavior will unconsciously begin reflecting that belief. You might speak carefully, trying not to upset them. You might explain yourself repeatedly, hoping to be understood. You might invest extra energy into maintaining harmony. None of these actions are wrong by themselves. But when they are driven by the fear of losing someone, they carry a different emotional tone. That tone is felt by others. Murphy described this as the law of subconscious impression. The subconscious mind accepts feelings and beliefs as instructions, and then organizes your behavior and experiences around those beliefs. If your subconscious belief is, "I must hold on to this person or I will lose them," your energy becomes focused on preventing loss. And the strange thing about focusing on preventing loss is that it keeps your attention locked on the possibility of losing. Your mind becomes alert to signs of distance. Your emotions become sensitive to small changes in behavior, and slowly, the relationship begins revolving around maintaining stability rather than naturally enjoying connection. But the moment something shifts internally, everything begins to reorganize. When you reach the point where you genuinely accept that you are willing to walk away if necessary, the subconscious mind receives a completely different instruction. Instead of focusing on holding the connection together, it begins operating from self-respect and emotional certainty. Murphy believed that certainty has a powerful influence on how life unfolds around us. When the subconscious mind accepts something as fact, it begins shaping our reactions, our tone, and even the opportunities we notice. This change may seem subtle from the outside, but it carries a strong emotional signal. The person who once felt they needed someone's approval suddenly appears calmer. Their conversations become simpler. They stop trying to persuade or justify themselves. They stop reacting emotionally to every shift in attention. And when people encounter this kind of stability, their perception changes. Because emotional certainty has a magnetic quality. It does not demand attention, but it naturally draws attention. Murphy often said that the subconscious mind responds to the feeling of already being complete, rather than the feeling of lacking something. When someone feels incomplete without another person's validation, their energy communicates that sense of lack. But when someone feels internally complete, their presence communicates something entirely different. It communicates balance, confidence, independence, and independence changes the emotional equation in relationships. Think about it this way. When someone senses that you are trying to keep them close, they may unconsciously feel that they hold the position of power. But when they sense that you are perfectly capable of moving forward without them, the dynamic becomes equal again. They begin to see you as someone who chooses connection rather than someone who depends on it. This is the deeper law Murphy was pointing to. Life reflects the beliefs held within the subconscious mind. If your internal belief is that you must chase recognition, you will often find yourself chasing it. But if your internal belief shifts to quiet self-assurance, your experiences begin reflecting that change. And this is exactly what happens when someone reaches the point where they are no longer afraid to walk away. Their subconscious mind has accepted a new belief, a belief that their value is not determined by another person's attention. And the moment that belief becomes real inside them, their energy begins communicating something powerful without any effort at all. That silent communication is often what surprises the people around them. Because when someone realizes you are no longer trying to hold on to them, they suddenly see you in a completely different light. But the real turning point is not the act of leaving. It is the moment your need for validation quietly disappears, and that realization leads us to the central insight behind this entire idea. Now we arrive at the central insight behind all of this. The reason people often react so strongly when they realize you're leaving is not because of the act of leaving itself. It's because of the shift in energy that happened before you ever took a step away. For a long time, the dynamic may have been built on your effort, your patience, your explanations, your willingness to keep trying even when things felt unbalanced. Whether you realized it or not, Part of your attention was focused on keeping the connection alive. You were hoping the other person would eventually see what you were giving. But the moment you internally accept that you are willing to walk away, something fundamental changes. Your need for their validation disappears, and that disappearance is extremely noticeable, not because you announce it, but because your behavior becomes quieter and more certain. You stop repeating the same explanations. You stop reacting emotionally to every small shift in their mood. You stop trying to prove how much you care. Instead, you begin carrying yourself with a calm sense of acceptance. You're not trying to push them away, but you're no longer trying to hold them either. And this is where something surprising happens. For the first time, the other person feels the absence of your effort. They feel the space where your attention used to be. The constant reassurance you once provided is no longer there. The emotional pursuit they may have grown accustomed to quietly disappears. And that absence creates awareness, because human beings often become aware of value when it is no longer being constantly offered. When something is always present, it becomes part of the background. But when that presence begins to withdraw, attention immediately sharpens. Suddenly, the person who once seemed calm about the situation begins to feel curious. They may notice that your tone is different. They may notice that your reactions are calmer. They may notice that you no longer seem invested in winning every conversation. And the question begins forming in their mind: what changed? This is the moment when the dynamic reverses. The person who once seemed emotionally distant may begin paying closer attention. They may ask more questions. They may reach out more often. Sometimes they may even express feelings they never showed before. Not because you forced them to, but because they are sensing that your energy has shifted. Joseph Murphy often spoke about the power of emotional certainty. When the subconscious mind accepts a belief completely, your entire presence reflects that belief. If you believe you must chase someone's attention, your actions will reflect pursuit. But if you believe that your value exists regardless of someone's response, your energy becomes calm and self-assured. And people respond very differently to that energy. When someone senses that you are no longer trying to convince them to stay in your life, something unexpected happens. They begin to see you as someone who chooses connection rather than someone who needs it. That difference changes perception instantly. Because people naturally respect emotional independence. They respect the person who can walk away peacefully if something no longer aligns with their well-being. It signals strength. It signals clarity. It signals that your life is not defined by another person's decision. And when someone finally realizes that you are capable of moving forward without them, they often begin to see your presence in a completely new way. For some people, this realization creates curiosity. For others, it creates admiration, and sometimes it creates a desire to reconnect in a more balanced way. But the real power of this moment is not about how they react. It's about what changed within you. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped trying to convince someone to recognize what should have been obvious. You returned your attention to your own peace, and that shift sends a silent message stronger than any argument or explanation. It says, I value myself enough to walk away from what no longer respects me, and that quiet certainty is often what surprises people the most. Because the moment they realize you're leaving, they also realize that the person they once took for granted is no longer trying to stay. Ideas become much clearer when we see them in real life. Because this shift, this moment when someone realizes you are no longer trying to hold on to them, doesn't just exist in theory. It happens quietly in everyday situations all the time. Consider the story of a man who spent years trying to keep peace in a relationship that constantly felt unbalanced. Whenever conflict appeared, he was the one who tried to fix it. He explained his intentions, reassured the other person, and took responsibility for smoothing things over. He believed that patience would eventually solve everything. But over time, something began to wear him down. Every conversation felt like work. Every disagreement required him to prove his loyalty again. Instead of feeling appreciated, he felt like he was constantly trying to maintain something fragile. One day, without anger or confrontation, something inside him shifted. He stopped trying to explain himself every time tension appeared. He stopped chasing conversations that led nowhere. Instead, he quietly focused his attention back on his own life. He spent more time on his work, his health, and the parts of his life that brought him peace. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't threaten to leave. He simply stopped trying to hold everything together. Within a few weeks, something interesting happened. The same person who once seemed distant began reaching out more often. Messages appeared that hadn't appeared before. Conversations became softer, more curious. At first, he was confused. Why now? Why did the attention come only after he stopped trying so hard to earn it? But what had actually changed was not the other person. What had changed was his energy. When he stopped negotiating for understanding, his presence became calmer. When he stopped chasing connection, the space created curiosity, and that curiosity changed the dynamic. A similar pattern appeared in a completely different situation involving a woman at work. For years, she had been the most dependable person in her team. She stayed late, volunteered for extra tasks, and constantly tried to prove how committed she was to her role. Yet somehow her contributions were rarely acknowledged. She watched others receive recognition while her effort quietly became expected. Eventually, she reached a point where she decided something needed to change, not in anger, not by quitting, but by changing her internal approach. She stopped trying to prove her value through overwork. She continued doing her job well, but she no longer went out of her way to earn approval. She focused on doing her responsibilities clearly and confidently, without constantly seeking reassurance. Over time, something unexpected happened. Her presence became more noticeable. Because she was no longer chasing recognition, she carried herself differently. Her voice became calmer in meetings. Her decisions became more direct. Within a few months, the same managers who had once overlooked her began trusting her with larger responsibilities, not because she demanded attention, but because her confidence signaled something new. She no longer appeared like someone trying to prove herself. She appeared like someone who already knew her value, and people responded to that. These kinds of shifts happen in friendships as well. Sometimes someone spends years being the person who always reaches out first. The one who keeps conversations going, organizes plans, and maintains contact. Eventually they may begin to feel like the connection only exists because they keep it alive. So they stop initiating for a while. Not as a test, but simply because they want to see what happens if they step back. And often, that's when the other person suddenly becomes aware of the absence. They realize that the connection they enjoyed was supported by someone who cared enough to maintain it. Once that presence becomes less constant, they begin to reach out themselves. Again, the shift wasn't created by manipulation, it was created by awareness. The moment someone stops chasing a connection, the dynamic becomes visible. The effort that once went unnoticed suddenly becomes clear, and this pattern appears again and again in many areas of life. When your energy changes from seeking validation to quietly valuing yourself, people sense it. They sense the difference between someone trying to be chosen and someone who is simply choosing what aligns with their peace. Joseph Murphy often emphasized that our outer experiences reflect the beliefs we accept internally. When someone stops believing they must fight for recognition, their behavior naturally reflects that belief. Their tone becomes steadier. Their reactions become calmer. Their presence becomes grounded. And that grounded presence often changes how others respond to them, not because they demanded respect, but because they finally began carrying themselves in a way that reflected it. These stories are not about walking away to make someone chase you. They are about what happens when someone genuinely reconnects with their own self-respect. Because the real transformation begins the moment you stop asking others to confirm your worth, and begin living as if that worth was never in question. Understanding this principle is powerful, but its real value appears when you begin applying it in everyday life. Because the shift we've been talking about is not about dramatic decisions or sudden confrontations. It's about a quiet change in how you relate to yourself and to others. And that change begins with awareness. The first step is noticing where your energy is going. Ask yourself a simple question. Am I trying to be understood, or am I trying to prove my worth? There is a big difference between the two. Healthy communication is about expressing yourself honestly and listening openly. But when communication turns into repeated explanations, constant reassurance, or ongoing efforts to convince someone of your intentions, it often means your energy has shifted into proving something. And the moment you begin proving your value, you unknowingly place that value in someone else's hands. So the first practical step is this. Stop trying to prove what should already be visible. Your kindness should not require endless explanation. Your effort should not require constant defense. Your presence should not require negotiation. When someone truly sees you, they do not need continuous reminders of your worth. The second step is learning to redirect your attention. For a long time, many people focus their emotional energy on how someone else is responding. They watch for signs of approval. They analyze reactions. They adjust their behavior, hoping to maintain harmony. But the moment you begin shifting your attention back to your own life, something powerful happens. You reclaim your energy. Instead of wondering how someone else feels about you, you begin asking a much more important question. How do I feel about the way this situation affects my peace? This question changes everything, because it places your well-being at the center of your decisions rather than someone else's reaction. Joseph Murphy often spoke about the importance of planting new beliefs into the subconscious mind. One way to begin doing this is through calm, simple affirmations. Not forced or emotional statements, just quiet reminders that reshape your internal narrative. For example, you might begin repeating something like this: "My value does not depend on anyone's approval," or "I deserve relationships that feel balanced and respectful." These statements are not meant to convince anyone else. They are meant to help your subconscious mind accept a new truth about how you see yourself. Over time, this new belief begins influencing your behavior naturally. You speak more calmly. You react less emotionally. You stop trying to win arguments that lead nowhere. And perhaps most importantly, you become comfortable with the idea that not every connection is meant to last forever. The third step is allowing space. When you stop chasing constant communication, you create room for the other person to show their level of investment. This is not about testing someone. It's about allowing the dynamic to become clear. If someone values the connection, they will naturally move toward maintaining it. If they don't, that clarity is valuable too, because it prevents you from spending years trying to maintain something that only exists through your effort. Space reveals truth, and truth is always better than uncertainty. The final step is learning to carry yourself with quiet certainty. This does not mean becoming distant or emotionally closed. It means understanding that your worth does not fluctuate based on someone else's mood, attention, or opinion. You remain kind, you remain respectful, but you no longer abandon your self-respect in order to keep a connection alive. You become someone who chooses relationships that feel mutual, someone who values peace over endless emotional negotiation. And when this shift becomes genuine inside you, people notice it. Not because you announced it, but because certainty has a very recognizable energy. It's calm, it's steady, it doesn't chase, it doesn't beg. It simply exists with the quiet understanding that the right connections will meet you at the same level of respect. And the moment you begin living from that place, the dynamic around you begins to change. Because people respond very differently to someone who is no longer trying to prove their value. They respond to someone who already knows it. At some point in life, most people reach a quiet realization, a realization that changes the way they see relationships, effort, and even themselves. They begin to understand that their value was never something that needed to be earned over and over again. It was never something that depended on how well they could explain themselves, and it certainly was never something that should have required constant proof. For a long time, many people move through life believing that if they just try hard enough, people will eventually understand them. They believe patience will always lead to appreciation, They believe loyalty will always be recognized. And sometimes it is. But sometimes the deeper lesson is something else entirely. Sometimes the lesson is learning when to stop negotiating your worth. Learning when to stop asking someone to see what they have repeatedly overlooked. Learning when to quietly choose your own peace. This moment is not about anger, it is not about revenge, and it is not about proving a point. It is about clarity. The kind of clarity that allows you to recognize when your energy deserves a different environment. Joseph Murphy often spoke about the power of the beliefs we accept within the subconscious mind. When someone spends years believing their value depends on how others treat them, their emotional world becomes unstable. Every reaction from others becomes important. Every change in tone becomes meaningful. Their peace begins to depend on things outside their control. But the moment a person begins to accept a new belief that their worth exists independently of anyone's approval, their entire identity begins to shift. They stop seeing themselves as someone waiting to be chosen. They begin seeing themselves as someone who chooses. They choose the environments they remain in. They choose the relationships they invest in. They choose the situations that support their growth and well-being. And when someone begins living with that kind of awareness, their presence changes. They become calmer, they become more grounded, they become less reactive to situations that once consumed their attention. Not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped attaching their identity to how others respond. This shift is quiet, but it is powerful. Because people can sense when someone is no longer chasing approval. They can sense when someone is no longer trying to be accepted at any cost. And strangely enough, this is often when respect begins to appear. Not forced respect, not temporary attention, but genuine recognition. Because emotional independence carries a kind of gravity. It signals that you are comfortable with yourself. It signals that your life continues moving forward whether someone stays or leaves. And that kind of presence changes the way people interact with you. But here is the most important part of this entire idea. The goal is not to make someone react when they realize you are leaving. The goal is not to trigger regret or curiosity. Those reactions may happen, but they are not the real victory. The real transformation is internal. It is the moment you stop trying to hold on to situations that constantly drain your energy. It is the moment you stop explaining your value to people who refuse to see it. It is the moment you realize that peace is far more valuable than constant emotional negotiation. When that realization becomes real inside you, something powerful happens. You stop chasing validation. You stop waiting for permission to move forward. You stop asking others to confirm what you already know about yourself. And in that moment, you begin living differently. You begin moving through life with a sense of quiet authority, not loud confidence. Not arrogance, just a calm understanding that your presence has value, and that value does not need to be argued. So if there is one thing to remember from all of this, it is this. You were never meant to spend your life convincing people to appreciate you. You were meant to recognize your worth so clearly that you no longer remain where that worth is ignored. And when someone finally realizes you are capable of leaving peacefully without anger or desperation, that realization often surprises them, because the person they once believed would always stay has quietly learned how to choose themselves.